I'm in this marina in the south of France. It's a big marina. According to the port's website, it has space for 1,400 boats of various sizes, and it's just about full. That's a lot of boats that spend most of their time just sitting in the water. Is that good for them? Unused for most of the year? Some of these boats are more than 100 years old and made of wood, the oldest building material for boats. A few others are made of steel and aluminium. Perhaps there's even a concrete one hidden amongst the forest of masts. But most of these boats are made of fiberglass. And fiberglass, also known as GRP, glass reinforced plastic, sometimes FRP, fiber reinforced plastic. The generic term is composite, though in sailing, composite is often used as a reference for carbon epoxy high-performance boats, but they're all composite boats. Fiberglass seemingly came from nowhere after 1945 to completely overtake the traditional wooden boat builders by the late 1970s. It was hailed as a wonder material, one that didn't rot, hardly needed any maintenance, and wasn't subject to being eaten by marine organisms. These new boats were going to last forever with just a quick hose down at the end of a day's use. Sadly, none of these proved to be entirely true. The boats built from fiberglass were also dismissed by traditionalists as plastic, and especially for motorboats as plastic fantastics, intended as an insult. Perhaps the most dismissive insult came from L. Francis Herreshoff, the famous builder of superlative wooden yachts in New England, who described fiberglass as frozen snot. However, it turned out for the actual owners of these boats, the fact that they were plastic was indeed fantastic, as the maintenance was so much easier and cheaper. But where did this wonderful plastic material come from? Nearly all boats today are made of plastics, artificial fibers, and other composites. Were they invented specifically for boat building? Was it a lucky discovery? Did they have some visionary single inventor that loved boats and was determined to make boat building better? Let's find out. Let me first define what is meant by a composite material. The composite is a product which is produced from two or more constituents. These constituents usually have markedly different chemical or physical properties and are combined to create another with properties unlike the individual elements. Composites aren't just limited to boat building and have been used elsewhere for thousands of years. On land, these include ancient house building methods like wattle and daub, a mix of woven wood and clay, the mud and straw mixture used for making bricks, more recently steel reinforcing used in concrete, even plywood, which is used extensively in boat building alongside fiberglass, has a history that stretches back to the ancient Egyptians. The earliest example I can find of a sort of composite boat before fiberglass was invented are the ones made by the people living in the Euphrates River region around 7,000 years ago. The builders used the reeds that grew in the marshes. They provided lots of buoyancy, but little durability, as the boats were constantly being beached and launched from the land, or even just by being left in the water, much as sailors use their tenders today. To reinforce and waterproof the bottom of the boat, they used a tar or bitumen that rises to the surface in the area. But not just the tar. Over the years, they developed a mixture and refined it to include fish oil and crushed coral to create a durable protective layer. The remains of an ancient reed boat was discovered in 2002 at the mouth of the Euphrates in modern-day Kuwait. The archaeologists determined that the boat had been used to go to sea, probably because it was infested with the usual barnacles and other marine growth. Some problems with boat ownership seem to be eternal. But I do find it impressive that our ancestors were trying to solve the same problems that we struggle with today, even with our advanced anti-fouling. But reeds and tar are of limited supply in the world, and everybody else just went on building boats out of wood. The real advantage with fiberglass is that it was one of the first plastics, but it was not the very first. The first real, modern, commercially successful plastic was Bakelite. It was invented by Leo Baekeland, a Belgian chemist working in the United States. He finally perfected his mixture of phenol and formaldehyde by subjecting it to high temperature and pressure to produce a hard but moldable material sometime between 1905 and 1907. He called it, perhaps somewhat immodestly, Bakelite, and presented it to the world at the February meeting of the American Chemical Society in 1909, after the patent had been awarded. Bakelite really was the first plastic composite of the modern age, and allowed many objects to be manufactured that had either been too costly or even impossible to manufacture beforehand. It was heated and mixed with a filler material, often wood in the form of sawdust, before being pressed into a mould. We've all seen Bakelite products in old films: the telephones, cigarette holders, radios, household objects and jewellery. And many car, train and aeroplane interior components were made of Bakelite. As far as I know, no boat was ever constructed of Bakelite. It only lent itself to smaller mouldable items. However, it wasn't even the first plastic that Baekeland invented. For Bakelite, he invented a plastic material he called Novolac. This he considered to be useless, as it wasn't what he was trying to develop, and it was not a success at the time. However, Novolac's properties didn't find a real use until the development of microelectronics, more than 100 years after its invention, where it is now extensively used as part of electronic component manufacturing. Despite its unpromising start, almost everyone today owns something which contains Novolac, but nobody except collectors of antiques owns anything made of Bakelite. In tribute to his contribution to the modern plastic-dominated world we live in today, Leo Baekeland, who died in 1944, was posthumously inducted into the Plastics Hall of Fame in 1974. Yes, the Plastics Hall of Fame really does exist. So did Bakelite develop into fiberglass? No, fiberglass has a different history and a different chemistry, along with a new cast of characters. Let's start with the glass fibers. Let's start by confirming that they really are made of glass. Modern glass has been made into everything from thick, dense, bulletproof glass to incredibly fine fiber optic cables, as well as containers for liquids and lenses for glasses and mirrors for the Hubble Space Telescope. It's all glass. Although natural glass fibers have been seen before near volcanoes, where superheated gases burst through molten magma to produce fine strands of crude glass fibers, in volcanic Iceland these are called witch's hair, and in Martinique, where the volcano called Pelée, they are called Pelé's tears. It wasn't until the 1930s that the modern form began to be developed. How to make thin, reproducible fibers was seemingly discovered by accident by an American researcher working at Owens, Illinois, a company that specializes even today in producing glass for containers, jam jars and the like that we see every time we go to a supermarket. It is not recorded exactly how or why James Slater, a researcher at Owens, Illinois, directed a blast of compressed air at some molten glass, but he did. And the result of that action was that very fine glass fibers were produced. He could have known about the volcanic glass, but I have found no reference to that. After refining the process, which is a bit like how candy floss or cotton candy is made, a patent was applied for in 1932, and Owens, Illinois joined with Corning Glass to form Owens Corning to manufacture the product they've called fiberglass. That's glass spelt with just one S. It was originally sold as an insulating material, and it still is, of course. In 1936, chemical companies DuPont and American Cyanamid entered the scene with various resins that they were developing. Although humans have been using natural plant and animal resins as glues since the Stone Age, using them to adhere their flint arrowheads to the shaft of their arrows and spears, these were working on synthetic resins. Of course, developing a new product is one thing, but then you must find a use for it. That's not always obvious, as the story of Novalax demonstrates. Without going into a long description of the chemistry, let's just say that these are all concerned with various polymers. When mixed with the fiberglass wool, these replaced the air in the wool with resin, which reduced the volume immensely and hardened to a solid. This made it useless as an insulator, of course, but it created a new and strong, if brittle, material. In 1937, the first plastic boat was built by Ray Green, who was working with Owens Corning at the time. But the plastic they had then had to be heat hardened and proved too brittle to be practical. I suspect that the glass wool that they were using was probably not ideal either, as modern glass fibers are considerably thicker and longer. Further development of the fiberglass construction was helped by the invention by American Cyanamid of the first polyester resin that set at room temperature, removing the need for heating to cure the resin. By 1947, Ray Green had formed the Ray Green Boat Building Company and started producing the 16-foot Rebel sailing dinghy, which wouldn't look out of place on a lake or a bay today. In fact, there are still some of these boats being used. I don't think it's too dramatic to say that Ray Green was the father of the fiberglass boat building industry. From now on, though, the advances were all made by big companies with research teams, so an individual's contribution becomes less easy to identify. Another sector that really took an interest in early composite development was the aircraft industry, where they are always looking for novel materials with a combination of high strength and low weight. Fairchild, Republic and Vultee all built experimental planes with extensive fiberglass or resin-reinforced components. The Fairchild F-46, made with what they called the Duramold process, what we would now call resin-impregnated or resin-infused wood, first flew in 1937. The invention of room temperature setting polyester resin was jumped on by the military aircraft manufacturers, who were just starting to install radomes for the newly invented radar. Fiberglass is transparent to radio waves, as well as being easily moldable on a production line into aerodynamic shapes. Apart from glass, the other two fibers that have come to be used in the boat building world are carbon fiber and aramids. I think it would be a rare marina that would contain many boats with carbon fiber, it being so much more expensive than fiberglass. It has a long history though, starting with the carbon filaments made by Joseph Swan for his incandescent light bulbs. In case you're thinking, didn't Thomas Edison invent the light bulb? Not exactly. He was not the only person to do this. In fact, many people at the time were working on the problem of electric light bulbs. Several people had invented light bulbs of various reliability and practicality. In England, Joseph Swan was the leading inventor, and both he and Edison's designs were similar, but they had each developed some components better than the other. The first commercial manufacturer of light bulbs was the Edison Company, formed by Joseph Swan and Thomas Edison. The carbon filament technology was eventually replaced by tungsten, but I digress. Research went on to produce carbon fibers for other uses. Between 1958 and 1963, progress was made in the USA, Japan and the UK before a usable fiber was developed. The aircraft industry was the first adopter of carbon fiber, as the combination of lightweight and strength outweighed the increased cost. Some estimates put the cost increase at up to 30 times more expensive than normal fiberglass. Only now are prices becoming more competitive, but it's still expensive, especially as it uses the same resins that fiberglass uses, vinyl ester and epoxy. Another type of fibre that is used are aramids, that's Kevlar to you and me, mainly for localised strengthening and sometimes in sails. It is an aromatic polyamide rather than a glass and has several different brand names. It's a form of nylon, not a very strong material itself, but rearrange the molecules a bit differently and you have an incredibly strong fibre. It was discovered by Stephanie Kwolek at DuPont in 1965 and developed by them. Although Kevlar and carbon fibre are sometimes used in laminated sails, which are themselves layers of Dacron, Mylar and others, the most common strengthening fibre is Vectran, which is slightly different, being an aromatic polyester. If you ever see golden coloured threads in sails, that's Vectran or possibly Kevlar. Strangely, considering its use in sails, Vectran is very sensitive to UV light and can only be used when covered up by another material. From the beginning of the 1960s onwards, the whole world of fiberglass and its associated industries just exploded in all sorts of industries around the world as both the fibres and the resins developed. The nature of fiberglass construction changed too as it became obvious that moulding techniques were going to be the main method of construction for boats as well as other items. Chopped strand mat is probably the most familiar and is the basic material fabric for use with all the resins. It comes in various weights and thicknesses. After they developed that, they spun the glass into thinner and thinner strands and wove it into cloth. The different weaves and weights. The different weaves are mainly described by the weight per square metre or the strand angles to each other. 090 is at right angles, for instance. Biaxial is at a 45-degree angle across the cloth, and some fabrics are a layer of chopped strand mat and fabric stitched together to create a cloth with maximum stress distribution. Along with the fibres, the resins were being developed too. The three most commonly used resins are polyester, vinyl ester, and epoxy. The most common one used in the boat building industry is polyester resin. It's the first resin that hardened at room temperature and didn't need an oven. It's the most common building material for boats, but is it the best? Well, it's the best for cost as it's the cheapest, and for many boats its strength is good enough. It can certainly be used for parts above the waterline and on smaller boats and dinghies where stresses are smaller. Polyester and vinyl ester resins are also the main components of gel coat, that shiny white coating that covers the fibres and gives a yacht its distinctive look. It's essentially resin with coloured solids dissolved in it, usually white. Vinyl ester is a mix of epoxy and acrylic polymers and has strength and cost somewhere between polyester and epoxy. Many boat builders use vinyl ester for the hull and deck as it has better resistance to water and other liquids, and polyester for interior fittings and mouldings. Both polyester and vinyl ester are mixed with styrene, which gives it that distinctive smell. They're also both catalyzed with tiny amounts of various peroxides, usually 2%, but with some leeway between 1 and 3%, which a boat builder can adjust depending on temperature and the speed of cure required. Styrene is now being phased out by some manufacturers with concerns that it may be carcinogenic in its raw form. Apart from any health advantage, it means that it doesn't smell quite so bad when you're working with it. Epoxy, which everyone seems to have heard of, is the least used in boat building because of its cost, though it is extensively used in boat repairs and refurbishment. Just about the only complete composite boats built with epoxy are also built of carbon fibre and aramids. The builders of such boats are usually building one-off boats for very rich people or race boats which will be sponsored by large corporations. The only boat parts that are consistently made with carbon fibre and epoxy are masts and booms, as the strength and weight advantage makes it worthwhile. Epoxy is chemically very different from the other two. It doesn't use styrene, so it doesn't smell so bad, but it's still an unpleasant chemical when wet. It doesn't use a catalyst, but a hardener, usually an amine, which must be mixed in exact ratios. Different hardeners can be used, but the ratios must be strictly adhered to. There were a handful of small, independent boat builders building fiberglass boats in the 1950s, mainly in the United States. The biggest problem was getting hold of the materials, as the Korean War was on, and it was deemed a strategic construction material and jealously guarded by the military. To name but two, Bill Tritt of Glassbar in California was making sailboat masts from 1946 and small boats from 1947, as well as car parts, especially for the custom car scene in California. And Henri Hamel of the famous Hamel Yachts in La Rochelle, France, built his first 28-foot yacht of fiberglass in 1958. The hand layup style of building over a wood or plywood frame is still a much-used method today, especially for self-build dinghies and tenders, as well as full-sized yachts. The basic construction method in mass production fiberglass boat building is first to create a buck, that is, a full-scale model of the exterior of the hull or the deck. From the buck you then make a mould from which you will make the finished boat. Both the buck and the mould should be finished as perfectly as possible, as every defect will show up in the finished gel coat. You start by laying up the gel coat inside the mould before laying up the main skin. Gel coat on a production boat is often pretty thin, 5 to 8 millimeters is typical, often less. The bulk of any hull is chop strand matte if it's a normal production boat, perhaps some other cloth for extra strength or stiffness in crucial areas like chain plates. A quick, cheap method of laying up chopped strand fibers is with a chopper gun. It mixes the resin and the fiberglass while spraying the surface a bit like a paint gun. The speed of layup is much faster than laying sheets of cloth up by hand. Essentially, a modern boat is constructed from the outside inwards and in two main parts. The hull, which is fitted with the interior components, which are made off-site, like the heads, engines, the tanks for fuel and water, before the deck, which is made separately, is put on top and attached. As far as sailboats are concerned, I know that the Nicholson 32, built in Portsmouth Harbour by Halmatic in the early 1960s, was one of the first production fiberglass yachts in the UK. I can testify from personal experience of these yachts that the builders seemed unsure how strong fiberglass was, so they built a hull about an inch thick, which was the thickness of a wooden hull. It made the boats strong, that's for sure, but it also made them heavy. At sea, along with the traditional full-length keel, the weight gave the boat excellent seakeeping qualities. However, they were a nightmare to control in a marina, especially in a stern with an underpowered engine. Eventually, in the 1960s, several traditional boat builders around the world saw the possibilities for mass production and seized the opportunity to revolutionize the boat building industry. They started producing relatively cheaper than before anyway, easy-to-maintain pleasure boats. Beneteau in France, which if not currently the biggest yacht builder in the world is definitely one of them, has produced thousands of hulls since starting with a small dinghy in 1964. Over the years, the boats have generally become stronger and lighter as a better understanding of the materials and better designs have evolved. Unfortunately, the promise of everlasting and invincible hulls gave way to a realization that seawater is one of the most hostile environments for any material that didn't evolve there. Pretty soon there was talk of a small creature called the polyester mite that nibbled away at the hull and caused blisters to appear. This started as a joke in the April edition of a yachting magazine. I forget which one, but if you know, please put a comment below if you can. What we now know as osmosis is a problem for nearly all fiberglass boats after a certain time, but there are ways of curing the problem. There are several steps to go through depending on your boat and the extent of the damage. But once the hull is both dry and the blisters are repaired, All you need is a single layer of fiberglass saturated with epoxy resin, and that is enough to keep the hull dry. It's got to be painted though, as epoxy is sensitive to UV light. Perhaps now fiberglass boats will live up to their early claim to be immortal or at least endlessly rebuildable. A boat, and for me a sailing yacht especially, is a thing of both beauty and utility, and the fact that it's made from two substances that, on their own, are neither, is a demonstration of human ingenuity. Ray Green, who made the very first fiberglass boat and built many others, including the first Sparkman and Stevens designed fiberglass yacht in 1957, passed away in 2001 and saw the incredible development of the yachting industry that he helped to launch. Fiberglass also made it possible for many more people to go sailing, as it reduced the cost of getting afloat. Today, the word plastic has many negative connotations, but I think we'd all be the poorer if we didn't have fiberglass yachts in our lives.